I'm very, very happy to welcome all of you to the first event in the series called The Dialogue Beyond the Bookshelf. This is something that came about after several conversations that uh, our team, the Hindus team, had with Bharitan and Colloquial. The idea was to actually put something together that gave us an opportunity to kind of discuss things, to have these freewheeling, in-depth conversations about not just books, not just with authors, but also about publishing, about the industry, about how things are changing, the kind of books that India is reading today. What are we thinking about? So it's wonderful to have for our first guest, Ira Makhoti. I'd like to just do a quick introduction, a more formal introduction, and then we'll of course have a longer one from her. But Ira Makhoti is the author of Akbar, The Great Mughal, Song of Draupadi, a novel, Daughters of the Sun, Queens and Begums of Mughal Empire, and Heroines, Powerful Indian Women in Myth and History. In The Lion and the Lily, which is her latest book and the one that we'll be discussing today, The Rise and Fall of Awadh, she brings to focus Awadh in the 18th century through Persian, English, and previously untranslated French sources, as well as recent work by art historians. The book is a nuanced account of one of the richest and most coveted regions in Hindustan in the 18th century against the background of the international struggle between Britain and France. Ira, welcome. And I think it'll be great to actually get a little bit about the book from you. How would you describe The Lion and the Lily?
Yeah, thank you for having me here. Thank you to everyone for inviting me here. Um, the idea for the book was a long time in the making. I've been thinking about a lot of my books push back against the common narrative that we are given about history in India in some way or the other. A lot of our early modern history is handed to us from colonial sources, from British sources. So we tend to have a sort of very linear view of how history happened. But one very interesting thing that I've been looking at is the influence of the French in India all through the 18th century, which we tend to have forgotten to, a great extent. So I have a little confession to make here today is that if you look at the dedication to my book, I think by the time you write your fifth book, nobody's very bothered about who you're dedicating. Once your husband and your children are done with, no one really bothers with the dedication of it. But it's actually dedicated to my two grandmothers, one of whom was a Bengali lady who only spoke Bengali, and the other was a French lady who only spoke French. So they didn't even have English in common. So the idea of language and how it shapes our memories, how it shapes our myth making, even familial or on a more national, level, is something which has really fascinated me. Secondly, writing early modern history, Mughal histories, for example, as a non-academic, I've always felt a little bit at a disadvantage because I'm asked, do you speak Persian? How do you access the sources? So that's always a little unfortunate for me not to be able to speak Persian. So finally, I was able to say, I read and write French, So on a very petty level, that is also one of the reasons that I looked into this book. But the whole idea of having a somewhat French background myself personally meant that I knew that there was a French element to our history over here, but there was really very little said about it. So when I started looking at it, I realized that there was a huge French influence from the very end of the 17th century up until the early 19th century. So it wasn't a flash in the pan. It was actually a huge influence. So that is very loosely the background of the book. But then writing about 150 years was very overwhelming. And I thought it would be more interesting to look at French influence through one particular Indian province that was using the French to fight back against the British.
Hence Awadh.
And
so actually that was one of the questions that I wanted to start with was kind of pinpointing what you talked about, the span, the kind of scope of what you had to cover. How did you arrive at Awadh, this time period, these personalities, the cast, the diverse cast in the book? Could you talk a little bit about kind of the genesis of the book itself and what would go into it, and how would you pick the area and the people who would populate?
Yeah, that's an excellent question because it's a question that really troubled me for a long time. So the 18th century, as we know, was a very complex, tumultuous time, volatile, a lot of things happening. But a lot of the things that we are told about the 18th century is also quite misleading. The two great falsehoods in a way that I found, about the 18th century that have been handed down to us primarily through colonial recordings is the fact that on the one hand, it is a time of general moral decrepitude and the country thereby is being characterized by this general lassitude, by this moral, sort of way in which it is being debauched, degenerate, right? And so definitely the rise of the Brits is shown as inexorable, inevitable, almost helpful for us. They are coming to save us from our own moral degeneracy. So that was one thing which was not true, really, because yes, the Mughal center was beginning to crumble, especially after Nadir Shah in 1739. But that simply meant that all the money, all the resources, all the talent, all the military skill went to the so-called provinces, whether Murshidabad, Hyderabad, Lucknow, Faizabad, all these areas grew as these local rulers stopped sending tax money back to the Mughal center because they realized that was, like putting water into a bucket with a hole. So they kept their huge resources, their tax money, and they started investing in their provinces. And all the talent from Mughal India, which, was extremely rich in cultural resources, all migrated to the so-called sub-imperial provinces. And secondly, the second big falsehood that I found was that we are also told that Indians didn't resist much. The sort of rulers and the local elite sort of accepted British rule as it came around by and by, and they kind of rolled over and said, okay, fine, what can we do? That's completely untrue. As I've covered a lot in the book, we can talk later, at every level, people were resisting. There were uprisings, there were insurrections way before 1857. The ladies, the Begums resisted. They caused an insurrection in the 1780s, which eventually caused the impeachment of Hastings, his trial for impeachment, the Governor General. So these are the two things, myths that I wanted to bust in a way. And I found that once Bengal was lost to the British after Buxar, Awadh came up as the next huge province. And therefore, all the French players who were in a way, once the British won Buxar and they destroyed Pondicherry and Chandanagar and all the other factories, all French money, influence, military adventurers, traders, all flocked to Awadh because they realized that Shuja-ud-Dawla, the Nawab, the third Nawab, was really the man to court. He was the one with the military prowess, with the determination, the skill, the intelligence, the diplomacy, and the cultural know-how to counter the British.
You talked about how this question is going to come up later about the busting of stereotypes, because you talked about how there's been a kind of understanding of the ways the princely states and the Nawabs kind of function. And for the layperson who doesn't dig into history but reads, say, on and off about it in straight text here or there, that's the impression that we're left with. But to bust stereotypes that have almost penetrated culture to the point that now that's the narrative, that's the only standing narrative now. I wanted to ask you about your sources, about how you do something like that. How do you kind of dig into what was misreported, or what was, the accounts that have survived for so long? How do you go down that rabbit hole of research and find material that will tell you otherwise? Because the whole point of that narrative is it's kind of made all the other narratives disappear. It kind of overwhelmed everything else, overpowered everything else. So what is the process for a historian to kind of go down that line and find material that would prove otherwise? How do you do that?
So that's really the, $100 million question. I realized when I was writing Daughters of the Sun that was going to be critical to my understanding of the history that I wanted to write, and also to find the sources. What I learned when writing Daughters of the Sun, when I began writing it, some very eminent historians told me that I was wasting my time, that there were no sources, on women's history. But I think Daughters of the Sun remains my most successful book because I did find so much material. It's just that it's ignored. In the traditional narratives, we always give far greater agency to male historians, to male histories, to sources that come even from written records. We tend to prioritize written records over, say, oral records, over architecture, over epigraphic sources, over paintings. So it is always far harder to find sources for women, but they do exist. Women, in this case, I'm replying to your question about narrative and trying to counter the typical narratives. I wanted to see what the women were doing, the Begums, along with the Nawab, and I found that they were extraordinarily powerful. But how was I able to find this? So when I started writing this, I reached out to all my sources who have been helping me in the past, and Asif Khan Dhelbi, who conducts these wonderful heritage tours, he's an important source to me. He doesn't write much, and there's nothing written that I can access, but just following him along the roads and gullies of Delhi and listening to his language and the emotion in his voice tells me so much about a period. And he wrote to me and said, Ira, if you're writing about Lucknow or Awadh, look at this source by Faiz Baksh. So I found this book. Somehow it was still on Amazon. I think I got only half of it because it's been, I think, broken into two. It starts halfway through a sentence, which was very disconcerting in the beginning.
First one ever.
I never did find the first one, but it's just a genealogy. So I said, we will let that be. But Faiz Baksh was the attendant or the deputy of a Khwaja Sara of the Begums of Awadh. Now, a Khwaja Sara is what we would call a royal or elite eunuch. And this was what the Begums used as their interface with the world, because these were women who were very strongly parda bound. They were within their zananas, they wore the parda. Their voice was supposedly not to be heard by a male outside of the family, though I quote an incident where we do hear her voice, in fact, Bahu Begum. But this Faiz Baksh was the deputy to the most powerful Khwaja Sara of Bahu Begum, Jawhar Ali Khan. And so he, luckily, because he's a literate, erudite man, he finds that because the Begums in their own time was so powerful and had such an influence on culture and on, the memory and the consciousness of Faizabad, he said, I have to write a history of them. And so he writes from within the Zanana, if you like. So you get all these anecdotes about the women, about their day-to-day activities, but also about their very powerful interactions with, through diplomacy, through the Khwaja Saras, with Hastings, with the French, with the Nawab, with the other states in India. So it's extraordinary. They were actually, carrying out their political agency on a par with the Nawab and the English. So at one point, it's written very clearly in the English record that there are three centers of power in Awadh. It's the English, the Nawabs, and the Begums. So that's something that we have entirely forgotten, because the British found it extremely unsettling to deal with these women, because, in that time in England, women were to be barely seen and certainly not heard, Victorian England. So they found it outrageous. So on the one hand, they would lecture the Nawab Asif Ud-Daula about how he must remember the sanctity of, motherhood and be respectful to his mother when, she made some complaints. But on the other hand, when Bahu Begum said, let us parley directly, let us work together. I will appoint the minister that you want, but, let us work together so I can rule my lands. He wrote back to the EIC saying, how dare a mere woman think that she will appoint minister, So this attitude of the British meant that they have obliterated the visibility of these women completely. And so we have learned a very one-dimensional side of the history of Awadh and, of course, of India itself.
So, the idea that Faiz Baksh wrote from within, the Zanana and the fact that he was writing such intimate accounts of these women, this would be a treasure trove if it was maybe something that, the fact that you could only find half a book and find it on Amazon as something that might not be even available widely is a very telling sort of, it also kind of signals to the fact that there must be so much more out there that's lost the way something like this was. You pointed towards it from, sources that you've worked with before. Is there anything else that you came across that kind of has been lost to history, has been sort of forgotten about? That helped this book? What was there art? Were there letters? Were there any other sources that you'd like to talk about?
Yes, definitely. In fact, one area which really fascinated me. So we were talking about at a time when there are a lot of European gentlemen living in these provinces, taking on the lifestyle of an so-called Nawab. So they're called the Nabobs, and they're making a lot of money. it's always interesting that the accoutrements of this lifestyle that they choose to take are nice clothes, hookahs, and women. But because they are doing this, they have inroads into local culture, and it has always been interesting to me to wonder whether the Indian BBs of these men, so they have common law wives. Let us say they often don't marry them, but they live with them. They're accepted as their BBs. Sometimes they're courtesans, sometimes other ladies. And I've always wondered if these women were able to facilitate the inroads that these men were able to make, say, with the Mughal court, because these women were sometimes aristocratic women who came to Awadh looking for refuge and then having very little options, set up with an important European man. And then this, I think, would give them access to the Mughal Zanana and thereby, the Mughal emperor. So to come back to your question, there was one particular woman that I was very interested in looking at. So this is the Indian BB of a man called De Boyne. And Benoit de Boyne was a very, very powerful military commander. In the end, he fought for the Marathas, their most successful European commander ever. And he came to Lucknow at one point and mingled with William Palmer, who was the English resident. Through William Palmer, he met William Palmer's BB's wife. And he then set up home with her and eventually took her and her children back with him to Europe. So I wanted to show you the sort of research it took me, because I did want to talk about her. So for those of you, I hope, who can see, on the right is a close-up of a very famous painting called William Palmer and His Family. So we see him with his BB on the right holding a baby. So that is Faiz Baksh, who was his common law wife, whom he lived with for his entire life, in fact. And to his left is a woman who's sort of leaning against him. For a long time, in fact, scholars thought that woman is probably his second BB, because they thought that she was leaning her arm on his leg. So that sign of intimacy tended to suggest that this was his BB. But now, when they cleaned up the painting, and if you take a good look at it, you can see that that is actually William Palmer's own hand on his leg. He's resting it like this. That other woman is now acknowledged to be Noor Begum, Faiz Baksh's sister, who is the woman who then, Benoit de Boyne, comes to this very court at this very time, meets her, and then takes her on as his baby. So I wanted desperately to know more about her. She's really not there in the records at all. It is said, okay, so he married this woman and then she disappears from the record. But I knew there was more to her, because he is a French-speaking man in the area which was independent at the time, the Duchy of Savoy, but today is in France. So luckily, I was able to track down their descendants. So the descendants of Benoit and Noor Begum lived to this day. They are the counts of the De Boyne area, and I contacted the gentleman who said, yes, come and see my family archives, no problem. So at the bottom here, this letter, if you can see this letter written here, it is actually a letter written by Bibi Noor Begum to her philandering husband, because he abandoned her, in fact, when he takes her back to England, leaves her in a little village outside London, and himself goes to France and remarries a 16-year-old French aristocrat. So she keeps writing him these letters, which shows us she was literate, that she had picked up English, she was able to articulate her thoughts. And in this particular letter, she's telling him, she's sort of forgiving him for the death of their daughter, because she died en route to France. But many of her letters are so interesting, because she also sort of uses blackmail against him and says, and she runs up debts, enormous debt, because she's living in a little village outside London, but she's living like a Mughal Begum, and she needs ass's milk, maybe to bathe in, I don't know. She needs her dressmaker, she needs, her chariot maker. So she sends him these letters saying, you please clear my debts, otherwise everyone in the village will know that you have abandoned me. You are not paying your debts, because they know that we are related. So I thought that was extraordinary. That told me a lot. And then I went to visit the village where she lived for many, many years of her life, because she lived far longer than Benoit de Boyne. And in a little church in Horsham village, this typical, beautiful English village, there's an old church with an old cemetery, and all the graves are aligned north-south, as is the tradition. There's one which is east-west. So that's Noor Begum's, grave. And even though she converted to Christianity and was very active in the local church, went to the church every Sunday, she chose to be buried in the classic Muslim way. So, that also told me something about the sort of women she was. So when writing about women, you really have to dig deep and find alternative sources.
In fact, while you were speaking about how you kind of found the descendants, the grave, the letters, the stories behind what was happening with her in her marriage, how we're all interested in crime fiction. We like watching thrillers where a detective will go down a rabbit hole and find like these little, clues or red herrings, and then find like someone who's spoken to someone who's spoken to someone, right? And it always feels so thrilling. But actually, when you see what a historian does, it's no different. There might or might not be a murder involved, but there
was
is
a murder involved.
Yeah, that's what. But there's always that search. There's always that one clue that leads to another clue that leads to another clue, and that seems to be what a historian, especially a historian looking into possibly source materials that are no longer known by. So we find a letter that a woman wrote centuries ago to her husband, or to find a grave and the reason behind why she was to be buried a certain way. It is a little like detective work, isn't it? How do you go about, like, the question here is, there is so much, and you're looking at so many different things, you're looking at so many sources. How do you kind of arrive at, okay, so now this is where I stop looking and I turn what I have found into the story that I'll tell? Because the more you look, the more layers will open up. How do you kind of decide?
Yes, that's 100% a problem. I think, Anshul is here in the audience and she would agree with me that at some point we have to decide how much to put in the book also, because the other day I gave a talk which was entirely based on materials that I have not used in the book, even though it's huge and tells us so much about the period. So it is like detective work. I've often thought of myself as a medieval detective sort of, person, because it takes so many levels, especially when I'm interested in the hidden stories, the women's stories. This family archive, for example, it's not digitized, it's not there anywhere. So, if I hadn't been told by William Dalrymple that there are these archives then in Savoy, I wouldn't have known to go there. So there's happenstance is very much part of it. Luck sometimes, takes you to certain places. But then you can really go down rabbit holes as well, So there are certain periods that are just so enigmatic and thrilling that you want to dig deeper. So I think one has to be very disciplined with oneself at a certain point, pragmatic, because your publishers are not giving you the keys to the treasury to do all of this work. A lot of this work involves travel and therefore money. So, for example, one of our great collections of late 18th century art from Lucknow is in Berlin. The works commissioned by this Frenchman called Antoine Poirier, extraordinary albums, maracas, which completely put paid to the notion that there was no good work coming out of late 18th century provincial India. Completely puts a lie to that. But it's not digitized. It's in Berlin, So I did go for conference. I was very lucky to do that. But very little of that work I was actually able to put in it. So it is pragmatism as well. You have a certain limited resource and you have to think about your reader at the end of the day. How much are they willing to sit down? How long? Each page here, I have to think very clearly. Will they read one extra page? Will they want to know one more detail? So after a while, I guess comes from experience writing a certain number of books, you can gauge how much it's going to really catch a reader's attention, how much is crucial to the story you are telling, and the rest will have to stay for talks like this, interactions like this, and places where you can share the extra material.
Yeah, the other thing, this is not so much a question, but just an observation of the other thing that I guess a historian has to be good at is drawing people out with information, right? When you go to visit a descendant of someone who, they might not know so much or not know what they, right? So you have to have that conversation. You have to also, while you're a detective, you also have to be a journalist. You have to be an interviewer. You have to be someone who sympathizes, who kind of draws someone out so that you get that source material. Is that something that happens a lot, that you have to kind of know how to draw people out?
It does. Like in the case of this count, the boy who is of course today still around very much. I did tell him, I said, look, your ancestor was this great Maratha general. You remember him like that. He brought a huge fortune back to the region in Savoy. He's well known for that. I said, but I'm interested in his personal history. I have to tell you that, Yeah. And for example, corresponding conversations in Lucknow would have not had the same outcome. People here will not want me to dig into their personal histories and tell things about their babies or their, the women in their lives. But as a European man, he was, please go ahead. Anything that comes out on my ancestor, I'm very proud of. So yes, I do have to make my pitch and sell it, but I have to be truthful as well. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
A question that I did have for Ira right now, you talked about readers. A lot of us in the audience might not be historians, might not be people who read serious history. Maybe we read historical fiction. That's where we probably get our history from. But in your book, one of the things that happens is there is a lot of emotional truth, stuff that things that kind of give you the flavor of the movie, and then facts and dates and people and what they were actually doing and what they were actually saying. But then also these little moments which you couldn't possibly know about, but you have to gauge from something. So I want to talk to you about how do you kind of, walk that tightrope between getting the flavor of the period and getting the facts from the period, and also do you have a kind of balance you want to strike so that you stay on the journey that you've taken, but you also kind of open the readers who probably wouldn't otherwise read, big tomes or big books about a single person. How do you keep that interest, but also make sure you don't lose yourself in the tradition?
No, that's an excellent question. I hope everyone is paying strict attention because you will be quizzed. It's a very, very fine line, because I am writing narrative nonfiction. So I have to be absolutely certain of every fact that I'm presenting. But at the same time, I am writing for a lay audience. That has really always been what I want to do. I'm not here to convert any scholars who probably know all of this anyway. It is really for the lay person who doesn't have access to these sources, who's not in the space of privilege that I am to go to all these museums and, get access to all of these things. So I know that my lay audience, I have to draw them in and I have to keep them for 400 pages, So I find at the end of the day, it is bringing out human elements which keeps people's interest, showing the human behind a character that we know in history or don't know about at all. So little anecdotes are very interesting to me, often found in things like Faiz Bakhsh's accounts, so by, non-traditional histories. So, for example, he writes about this system that they had with Shujauddaullah's mother, Nawab Begum, just to show the sort of delicacy or sentiment of that time. So, Nawab Begum had her sort of maid in charge. And when this lady needed money for whatever reason, she wouldn't go up to Nawab Begum and say, I need money, please give me some money. She would say, the sacks of jewels or the sacks of money need some airing. We need to take them out for airing. So Nawab Begum would immediately understand what she meant, give her the keys to the treasury, and the lady would take out a few, sacks of cloths and brocade and all of that, take whatever she needed under the pretense of putting things in the air and airing it out a bit. So, these little things show me that the day-to-day life was of a certain standard. People interacted in a certain way. The other thing is often, the visibility of people. People like to know what people looked like, what they sounded like, how they behaved. So there is a section in my book that deals with Tipu Sultan. He has a walk-on part, but it's a powerful part, because of the French involvement. If you read the book, you'll find out. And he, at one point in 1788, sends an embassy to France, to the court of Louis XVI. And this was a fascinating thing for me. I was like, what were these men like when they landed up in Paris? And I had read accounts which said that they created a furore, a fashion furore. People were lining up to see their clothes and also to see when their food was being cooked, by their own chefs, what food, what spicy food. So clothes and food, two interests of the French which have lasted through the century. And I found this wonderful painting of Muhammad Darwish Khan. So he is one of the ambassadors. And what is wonderful for me is the fact that he's painted by a French portraitist. This woman who was very well known in her time, Elisabeth Vigée, but is now completely forgotten. She painted Marie Antoinette amongst others. And she paints this ambassador because she comes upon them in a social occasion and finds them so exotic and charming and handsome. And she said, I have to have a portrait of these men. The other two portraits are lost, unfortunately. But we do have this stunning image which shows us, firstly, his confidence as an Indian man in France, she writes and says that he stood up himself. Firstly, she had to get the permission. Like, we can't be painted by a woman unless the king gives permission. Once they get the permission, Elizabeth writes that he just stood up and grabbed his sword in a very natural manner. She didn't have to place them or anything. So you see the confidence of this Indian man, and you see the robes which created such a flutter. The gold kamarband and the beautiful muslin, which had almost caused a war in France because they tried forbidding it because it was, causing a loss to the French cloth industry. So things like this, which can actually show, add that visual element, because people today are very visual. And, I do try and add images and paintings and write about them.
Okay, so I would like you to talk about, you talked about how you gave a talk, you were giving, I think, a presentation about all the materials that didn't go into the book, right? What are the people who did go into the book and the ones who stayed out? Do you think they'll be making another book? Is that what happens when you are traveling with a story, when you're kind of looking into a period? Does it open up the way, a map kind of keeps opening up as you zoom out, and then there's a big sort of canvas and you will pick what comes next from that canvas? Is every book that you do leading you to another book?
It is in a way. I think it is in a way because you just gather so much resource about a time period. You start getting fascinated by one single thing and you're like, okay, one day I'm going to look. So for cast of characters, for example, I'd made this for another a talk that I gave. If there's any Mughal historian, I beg your forgiveness because I've used Akbar's orbital seal, the way he made his seal, to show you that this is Nawab Shujauddaulah and Asifuddaulah in the middle. And the sort of cast of characters, because the point I was making is that in the 18th century, we tend to think of people, nationalities, almost like we do of the Olympics today, that they are all belonging to one country, they speak that language, their loyalty is to that one country. And to extend this unfortunate, sporting metaphor, it is more, you can think of it more in terms of IPL. People fought for whoever paid the most, right? And for maybe some slightly random things that they had in common that we don't think important today. For example, in the 18th century, with England and France being at loggerheads throughout the 18th century, what was really important was whether you were Catholic or Protestant, much more than whether you were considered yourself French or British. So, for example, our man Antoine Pollier here that I have referenced about, being a great commissioner of Indian arts, he was actually from what is today a French-speaking area in Lausanne, which would have been probably considered, he was from a French family. But because he was Protestant and a very canny man when he arrived in Hindustan at the age of 18, he quickly aligned himself with the EIC, the British EIC, because their star was on the rise. So all of these men, and this is, by the way, Antoine, Benoit de Boyne, whose BB we have been, So that's him. These two you will recognize, perhaps Claude Martin, if there are any Lamartiniere people here, that's Claude Martin. And though he was very much a French speaker who spoke terrible English and was from Lyon, which was and is in France, so he had no business being with the English EIC, he nonetheless defected to them because for him, money mattered. So whoever paid him the most, so he went over his entire career, he went to the English. And this ruffianly looking gentleman like a pirate there, was a Breton from the northwest of France, and he also fought for whoever paid him the most. Though he said, if the French ever have need of me, I will sort of weigh in on the French, side. So you can see how the very idea of nationality was very fluid. And this is my primary cast of characters, but there are I could make 3 more slides of equally important people. Yes, definitely my next book will hopefully use some of the material I found.
I think just a couple of final questions. One of the other things is we will have a chance for the audience to have a question answer session with Ida. But just a couple of questions before we do that. One is, of course, you talked about food and art in the past thing, but I want you to expand a little bit more on that because the region that you have written about today has become almost synonymous with food more than anything else. The idea of food from Lucknow, from our people, is and it's for the layperson, it all comes from that period. But there's no that idea of kind of really tasting isn't it That's what the book does. So if you could talk a little bit about the food, I know that the recipes in the book also that's there. That's a very interesting addition. So, could you tell us a little about finding that train and how we can kind of track that down?
Well, in a lot of my books now, I was in conversation with food historian Mariam Reshi, and she told me long ago, Hira, always put food, in your books. Just as the musicologist Catherine Schofield told me, you have been ignoring music. You need to put music, and I'm like, how in the world am I now going to think about music? But I do understand the human experience is so much about these visceral things, about what we eat, even what we smell, the perfumes they use, the sounds we hear. I think I did make a big mistake in Daughters of the Sun, not talking about the sound. I think sound was so much a part of Mughal life. They lived around waterfalls and canals and fountains, and that sound, was very much part of their lived life. But, one does the best one can. But I knew I would write about food because of all of this, because Awadh has such a long tradition. I wanted to know also how these things come in, food and art, how did they land up in Awadh? So it is primarily a question of money. The Nawabs of Awadh were so wealthy at that time that they were in a position to buy up any talent. And that meant things like Mughal art, which from the time of 1739, Nadir Shah, the Mughal libraries were being despoliated. The art was landing up on the open market, and we are told by a historian that they were selling for the price of fruit and vegetables, precious Mughal documents, which today we would be in a museum. But Asaf-ud-Daula was very, knowledgeable. So he had his people go out and buy anything that they found at whatever price, which is why a lot of beautiful Mughal art ended up in Awadh. Similarly, any talent, like Akbar used to do, like he brought Tansen away, to his court. So that is what a great leader, Indian leader, did. He surrounded himself with the best talent, with an artist, a musician, cook. The cooks were paid incredible salaries, and one man, all he had to make, and his answer when he was asked, "What do you cook?" He said, "Mia, what else is there to make but korma and chapati?" So they specialized. They had their areas of specialization, and all these things, whether art, music, food, reached really great levels of excellence because the Nawabs were knowledgeable. We keep forgetting how very cultured and knowledgeable they were. It was part of their tradition. And because they had the money. So oftentimes, whether it's us today wondering how we're going to do research looking for money, or these talented artists, it is patronage. If you have a Nawab, if his elite courtiers want to follow his example and sponsor, if everybody around becomes interested, there's a saying in Awadh that even the beggars would be well spoken and would bless you by saying, "Khuda Hussain e gam ke siwa koi aur gam na de." That apart from the pain you feel for Imam Hussain, may you not be touched by any other grief. So they were so cultured down to that level. So that may be an exaggeration, but these are the sort of reasons that gave rise to the great Awadhi culture that we know about, and why I knew it would be, very important for my book.
Final question, I think, before we open it up to the audience, if there are any questions, would be, the idea of hidden histories, of histories kind of, smaller, maybe stories getting consumed in the bigger narrative that become the primary narrative. It's not that simple, right? There was one of the things that comes out in the book is, I think, Operation Legacy, right? The very systematic erasure of the history and the narratives of a certain period. I want you to tell the audience a little bit about Operation Legacy, because you will do it much better now.
Thank you. Yeah, that's so important, I think. We think, as you were saying, of forgotten histories or hidden histories, but it's not so innocent as that, So when the British were leaving in 1947, in fact, when they were leaving all these colonies in the 40s and the 50s, they undertook a program called Operation Legacy, in which they started destroying all the documents of a country that they were leaving that they deemed too sensitive to fall into local hands. I think in one country, I forget where, they actually had to bundle, there was so much material that they bundled it up into big boxes, tied it up with enormous with cranes, and lifted it and dropped it into the ocean so that nobody would ever find these incriminating documents. And all of these documents, in India, they simply in Delhi set fire to the great Mughal libraries, to all the material around 1857, because they wanted to do two things. They wanted to remove all signs of the highly criminal, violent activities that they had been indulging in. But they also wanted to replace it and make sure that all these colonies remembered England with a sense of that they, with the words they use, with kindness and respect. So we are meant to look upon them with kindness and respect for having destroyed, our heritage. So, for example, Lucknow, Asifudollah had a library that was 300,000 books. Imagine the depth of the knowledge he was trying to gather. And because all of it was dispersed, all of it after 1857, we have no idea of the sort of thing that he was trying to do. So Operation Legacy is just the visible bit of what happened throughout, because the British were actually extremely good at spin. They have always done this along the way. So they would destroy things that were incriminating and replace it by things that made us feel grateful, that made us feel that, well, this is the better of several evils, and how much better it is to have a British colonizer, for example. So this, I think, has been really insidious in the way we think about, especially the 18th century, has done a lot of harm in the way we see our own histories. But for example, the point I made about resistance, I myself used to think it's a pity that we didn't put up more of a fight. How did these rulers not put up more of a fight? But they really did. So you come to see that when you really dig deeper, because the British really tried to hide all of this. And they kind of portrayed it in the light of these people being, if it was Begum leading something, it would be very unwomanly. If it was Asifudollah, he was being debauched and irrational, So they replaced it with words that had a very powerful impact on our collective memories, which is why we tend to think of them in this way today.
I know I said we'll be done, but I have just one follow-up question to this, which is they tried to kind of make the other narrative disappear in the favor of the one that they wanted told. But because you've been digging for so long and so deeply into this, and also because India's country of oral history is also stories that have been passed down. In your research, in when you went to visit Lucknow, when you've been talking to people, have you noticed that despite all of this, people remember that public memory is still long?
100%. And that's a really important point, and that I have been making, is that when I went to Lucknow, to kind of find out about Asifudollah and Sridhar, I had a certain preconception in my mind, the Nawab Wajidullah, especially for somebody coming from Delhi, very much associated with debauchery, effeminacy, racy poetry, which was itself too effeminate. So I was wondering how the locals, viewed him. But the way in which they view Asifudollah, for example, today is entirely different. It shocked me, the extent of love with which they remember their Nawab, and they know that he is at the root of all the culture of Lucknow today, and they remember him for his generosity. So they always say, Jisko na de Maula usko de Asifudollah, that he was always willing to give to anybody in need. And he did, because it was actually a ploy that he used. He used generosity, I write in my book, as a weapon. If the British would bring something with a certain amount of money, he would outperform them, outplay them, spend more money. He sent money back to King George III when he recovered from a bout of madness, So he wanted to show he was on par, if not higher than them. And that is how Lucknowis remember Asifudollah, And I was absolutely touched by that. And that's when I knew that Asifudollah, because at that time I wasn't sure where I would stop, who I would center the book around. And so that's when I knew that it would be Asifudollah. And I was also told that, yes, we Lucknowis know he was homosexual, but that has no impact on anything at all. Whereas the Brits, the colonial recordings of that time was so confused, because they start by accusing him of being a womanizer, a philanderer. They're like, he can't have children because he has debauched himself with so many women. Then when they realize something is a bit different, they're like, this is so scandalous, we can't even talk about it. So that was very interesting to me, the way that Brits struggle to come to terms with this, and whereas the Lucknowi, for them, it's just a part of one facet of his life.
So you must read the book, because this is just a glimpse of what's inside the book.
No, thank you, Swati, for being here with me and having such wonderful questions. And thank you for this initiative to Bari Sons, Co-Local, for having this wonderful dialogue. I think this is the first in the series. Looking forward to many more.